There are machines that die slowly, worn down by years of hard work and the slow accumulation of mechanical fatigue, until one day the decision is made that repair no longer makes financial sense and the cutting torch is called. That is the ordinary death of a working machine, expected and unremarkable, the kind of ending that leaves no particular trace except a line in an accounting ledger. And then there are machines that are killed, not worn out, not retired, killed by a decision made in a room they would never enter, by men who never rode in their cabs, signed in an afternoon and effective immediately, leaving thousands of locomotives that had been running that morning sitting cold and idle by the following week, their fires drawn, their boilers drained, their futures erased by a single stroke of administrative will. This is the story of the Soviet P36, the most beautiful steam locomotive ever built in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a machine so refined and so capable that it represented the absolute peak of what Russian engineering could achieve in the age of steam. A locomotive that was supposed to transform passenger service across 11 time zones. A locomotive that was planned in the tens of thousands and delivered in the hundreds. A locomotive that was banned, grounded, and largely destroyed by a government decree before most of the people who were supposed to operate it had even seen one. And a locomotive that, against every probability, survived long enough to become the ghost that still haunts the history of Soviet rail. To understand the P36, you have to understand the country it was born into, and the particular kind of industrial logic that shaped everything that was built there during the years when Joseph Stalin sat at the center of all decisions. The Soviet Union in the late 1940s was a country simultaneously exhausted and ferociously ambitious. The war had consumed everything. 27 million dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, industrial infrastructure destroyed or relocated in the desperate scramble to keep production alive. The railroads had been central to the Soviet war effort in a way that had no real parallel in any other combatant nation. Everything moved by rail: troops, ammunition, food, the components of the factories that had been dismantled in the West and reassembled beyond the Ural Mountains. When rail lines were cut, armies starved. When they were restored, the tide of battle shifted. The railroads had not just supported the war. For stretches of desperate time, they had been the war. By the late 1940s, the railroads were being rebuilt and expanded. Stalin's post-war industrial plans were gigantic in scope and uncompromising in their demands. New lines were being built across territories that had never seen rail before. Existing routes were being doubled and electrified. The entire system was being pushed toward a capacity that the pre-war network had never approached. But at the core of the network, on the premier mainline passenger routes that connected Moscow to Leningrad, to Kiev, to the great cities of the Soviet Empire, something was falling behind. The passenger locomotives in service were adequate. Some of them were old designs that had been adequate for a long time, reliable in the way that heavily tested, deeply familiar machines become reliable through generations of accumulated knowledge about their quirks and their limits. But adequate was not the word that the Soviet state used to describe what it wanted from its most visible passenger services. The trains that carried party officials and military commanders and the carefully managed flow of important citizens between the centers of Soviet power needed to be something more than adequate. They needed to be, in the Soviet vocabulary of the era, worthy of the socialist state. The design bureau that received the mandate to create a new flagship passenger locomotive was the Kolomna Locomotive Works, one of the oldest and most technically sophisticated engineering organizations in Russia, with a history stretching back to the 19th century and a depth of accumulated expertise in locomotive design that had survived revolution, collectivization, purges, and war. What Kolomna produced in response to the mandate was the locomotive that received the designation P36, and it was, by the judgment of every engineer and historian who has examined it seriously, something genuinely extraordinary. The P36 entered the world looking unlike anything the Soviet railroad had produced before. Its boiler was large and cleanly designed, riding on a 4/8 four-wheel arrangement, 4 guiding wheels at the front, 8 driving wheels in the center, 4 supporting wheels at the rear. This configuration, which American engineers had used for their most capable passenger locomotives, provided a combination of stability at high speed, large firebox volume for sustained steam production, and a smooth ride that older, shorter coupled designs could not match. But it was the visual design that stopped people. The P36 wore a full, streamlined casing over its front end, sweeping back from the smoke deflectors along the boiler sides in a style that mixed European elegance with a confidence that was entirely its own. The standard paint scheme was a deep, rich green for the body, with a broad red stripe running the full length of the locomotive from nose to cab. Against the grey industrial landscape of Soviet rail infrastructure, against the weathered wooden platforms of provincial stations, and the industrial severity of the major terminal buildings, the P36 in motion was something that made people look twice, not because it was decorated for show, but because it communicated something in its proportions and its finish that most Soviet industrial products of that era did not communicate. It communicated care. The detail work on the P36 was not the detail work of a machine produced by workers who had been told to meet a quota. The cab interior was finished to a standard that Soviet locomotive crews had not previously experienced. Instrumentation was clear and logically arranged. The controls were positioned with attention to the ergonomics of a crew that would spend 12 hours at a time in that space. The pipework was routed cleanly rather than in the pragmatic tangle that characterized many working locomotives. The external surfaces were smooth in ways that required precision in manufacture that was genuinely difficult to achieve, and that served no purpose beyond the satisfaction of the result. This was a machine that its designers had wanted to be beautiful, and that they had made beautiful by doing the work that beauty required. In service, the P36 was equally impressive. On the main line between Moscow and Leningrad, the route that connected the two most important cities in the Soviet Union and that carried the highest status passenger traffic in the country, the P36 demonstrated that it could sustain high speeds with a smoothness and a reliability that its predecessors had not achieved. Crews that had operated older locomotives found the P36 noticeably different to handle, more responsive, more forgiving, better at recovering from the small upsets of normal operation, without developing into larger problems that required intervention. The boiler steamed freely. The valve gear was well designed. The riding quality was, by the account of engineers who operated it on high-speed runs, genuinely excellent. The locomotive tracking the rails with a solidity that made the high-speed miles feel secure rather than precarious. Unlike the Pennsylvania Railroad's T1, which had delivered extraordinary performance only to undermine it with a mechanical flaw that its crews could never fully trust, the P36 delivered its performance without the asterisk. It was fast, smooth, and dependable, and the men who operated it knew it. The Soviet Rail Ministry looked at the results and made a decision. The P36 would be built in large numbers. The plans called for production to continue for years, with locomotives being delivered to routes across the vast Soviet network, replacing older passenger power and eventually standardizing the premier passenger service on a single, modern, capable class. The numbers discussed were large. Thousands of locomotives deployed systematically across a country so enormous that even thousands would represent only a beginning of the transformation. For the engineers at Kolomna, who had created the P36, and for the locomotive itself, the future looked clear. It was not clear at all. On the 4th of August, 1956, Nikita Khrushchev signed a decree. The document was administrative in form, the kind of dense bureaucratic instrument that Soviet governance produced in enormous volumes and that traveled through ministries and departments as orders that were not suggestions. But its content was, for the Soviet railroad industry, a kind of thunderclap. The decree ordered the complete cessation of steam locomotive construction in the Soviet Union, effective immediately. No new steam locomotives were to be built. The factories that had been producing them were to be converted to diesel and electric traction. The transition was to be completed on an aggressive timeline that left no room for gradual phase-out or extended parallel operation. Steam was over. Diesel and electric were the future. The decision had been made at the highest level of the Soviet state, and it was final. Khrushchev's reasoning was not without basis. He had visited the United States and had seen with his own eyes how American railroads had already completed the transition to diesel traction. The efficiency advantages were real and well documented. Diesel locomotives required less maintenance, consumed less labor, and eliminated the enormous infrastructure of water towers, coaling stations, and ash disposal facilities that steam demanded. The Soviet Union, with its vast distances and its chronic labor shortages, and its perpetual pressure to extract maximum efficiency from every industrial resource, had strong practical reasons to make the transition. What made the decree remarkable was not its direction, but its speed. In the United States, the transition from steam to diesel had taken roughly a decade. With steam being retired as individual locomotives reached the end of their economic lives, and diesel being introduced progressively as the manufacturing capacity to produce it was built up. Individual railroads had moved at different speeds based on their own circumstances. The process had been, in the economic sense, rational, driven by the actual costs and benefits of individual replacement decisions. The Soviet decree eliminated all of that gradualism. Steam was not to be wound down, it was to be stopped immediately. The P36 locomotives, already in service, would continue operating while diesel replacements were built, but no new P36s would be manufactured. The production line at Kolomna, which had been gearing up for the long production run that the ministry's plans had described, was halted. The final P36 rolled out of Kolomna in 1956, the same year as the decree. The locomotive class that had been designed for thousands ended with 251 units. In the context of Soviet industrial production, 251 locomotives was a rounding error. It was barely enough to outfit a single major route in a country with 11 time zones. The P36 had been built for a role that it never had the opportunity to fill. Its story cut short not by any failure of its own, but by a political decision that landed on it like an axe. What followed was not immediate destruction, but it had the same end. The P36 locomotives that existed continued to operate through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, working the premier passenger routes that they had been designed for, demonstrating in daily service that everything their designers had claimed for them was accurate. On the Moscow to Leningrad line, on the routes connecting the major cities of the Western Soviet Union, the P36 did its work with the same competence and the same elegant appearance that had distinguished it from the beginning. But the infrastructure around it was changing. The support network that steam required, the specialists who maintained boilers and valve gear, and the 1,000 specific components of a steam locomotive, was being systematically dismantled. Coaling stations were being decommissioned. Water towers were being removed. The workers who understood steam were retiring and not being replaced because there was no reason to train a new generation of steam specialists for a technology that the state had officially declared obsolete. A locomotive is only as useful as the infrastructure that supports it. The P36 could run beautifully as long as it had coal, water, and maintenance. As those resources became harder to obtain, the logistics of keeping the P36 in service grew more complicated. Locomotives that needed major overhauls sat waiting because the shops that could perform those overhauls had been converted. Locomotives that needed specialist attention got generalist attention and ran less well for it. The mechanical quality that had distinguished the P36 in its early years began to erode, not because the locomotive had changed, but because the ecosystem it required was shrinking. By the late 1960s, the P36 was being withdrawn from mainline service on the premier routes, replaced by diesel traction that was less beautiful and less interesting, but vastly easier to support. The locomotives were cascaded to secondary routes, to less important services, to the kind of work that mainline passenger power ends up doing when it has been displaced from the assignments it was built for. On those routes, with less maintenance and less attention, the inevitable deterioration continued. By the mid-1970s, the last P36 locomotives in regular Soviet service were being retired. A few were preserved, set aside in the recognition that this was a historically significant class that deserved to survive. The majority were scrapped, their steel recycled into whatever the Soviet industrial economy needed steel for next. The locomotives that survived ended up in museums across Russia and the former Soviet republics. Some of them maintained in operating condition, others as static displays, their green and red paint still visible beneath the patina of years and the careful attention of restorers who understood what they were preserving. In a country that had built 251 of them and had planned for thousands, that small number of survivors was all that remained. There is a particular quality to the P36's story that separates it from most of the other great lost locomotives of the steam era. The T1 failed because of a mechanical problem that its designers could not solve. The Fell locomotive failed because its complexity exceeded what the railroad industry could practically maintain. The condensing engines of South Africa failed because the technical demands of their water recovery systems wore down the infrastructure meant to support them. In each of those cases, the failure was inherent to the machine itself. The locomotive was not adequate to the task, or the task was not adequate to the capabilities of the people and systems that had to support it. The scrapping was, in some sense, the correct outcome. The P36 did not fail. That is the part of its story that requires a different kind of consideration. The P36 was a locomotive that worked. It did what it was designed to do, reliably and well, and the men who operated it knew it and said so in the operational records that survived. Its failure, if failure is even the right word, was not engineering. It was timing. It arrived at the moment when the decision to end steam had already been made at a level of authority that no locomotive's performance, however excellent, could influence. If the P36 had been designed 5 years earlier, if its production run had been 10 years rather than 3, if the decree had come a decade later, when diesel technology had matured more gradually, rather than being imposed all at once, the story would have been completely different. The P36 would have filled the role it was designed for, would have accumulated the mileage and the operational history that give a locomotive class its place in the history of a railroad, would have been replaced eventually by diesel when the economics made that replacement genuinely rational rather than politically mandated. Instead, it was cut short. And the particular cruelty of that cutting short is that it happened to a machine that had done nothing wrong. The P36 was not an experiment that revealed unexpected flaws. It was not a compromised design that traded reliability for performance in ways that the daily operation of a railroad cannot sustain. It was, as far as any careful examination of its history can determine, simply a very good locomotive that was built in the wrong years and killed by a decree that had nothing to do with its qualities. The engineers at Kolomna knew what they had created. This is evident not from any record of their opinions, which were not the kind of thing that Soviet engineers expressed publicly when the matter in question was a decision made at the level of the party leadership, but from the care that is visible in the physical object itself. The details of the P36 are the details of a design team that was proud of its work and that believed the work would last long enough to matter. The streamlining was not applied as an afterthought or as a cosmetic addition to satisfy a bureaucratic requirement for modern appearance. It was integrated into the design in ways that reflected genuine aerodynamic thinking, that reduced drag at speed in ways that could be measured rather than merely claimed. The cab design reflected the kind of careful attention to the working environment of the crew that is only worthwhile if you expect the crew to be working in that environment for a long time. The mechanical layout reflected choices made for long-term maintainability, for ease of access to components that would need service over a decade or 2 decades of operation. None of those choices made sense for a locomotive that would be in service for 3 years. They made sense for a locomotive that was expected to work for 30. The gap between what the P36 was designed to be and what it was allowed to become is the real measure of what was lost when the decree came down in the summer of 1956. Not 251 locomotives retired before their time, though that is part of it, but the accumulated operational history that those locomotives should have generated, the refinements that would have come from years of serious mainline service, the institutional knowledge that grows up around a successful locomotive class when that class operates long enough for the people who work with it to truly understand it. All of that was cancelled. The handful of P36 locomotives that survive today occupy an unusual position in the memory of Soviet and Russian railroading. Unlike the machines that failed and were studied for what their failure revealed, the P36 is remembered for what it was, rather than for what it couldn't do. In the community of historians and enthusiasts who study Soviet locomotive history, the P36 occupies something like the position of a great musician who died young, not a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding capability, but a genuine loss, a mourning for equality that existed and was ended before its full expression was possible. The photographs of the P36 in service show a locomotive that knew what it was. There is something in the proportions of the machine, in the way the streamlined nose meets the boiler, in the relationship between the large driving wheels and the running board above them, that communicates a designer's confidence in the rightness of the design, not the aggressive confidence of a machine built to set records or to make a political statement, but the quieter confidence of a machine built to do difficult work well, and that has been built well enough to do it. That confidence was earned. The P36 earned it in the years it operated, in the kilometers it covered on the routes that mattered, in the judgment of the crews who drove it. And then the decree came, and the confidence had no more work to justify it. And the locomotives were sent to the secondary routes and the museum sidings and the cutting torches, and the story ended in the way that the stories of the best machines so often end in Soviet history, not with a dramatic failure, not with an explosion or a scandal or a flaw exposed, with a document, with a signature, with the particular kind of efficiency that centrally planned industrial systems can achieve when they decide to stop doing something applied to a machine that deserved better than efficiency in that particular moment. There is a question that comes up whenever people who know the P36's history discuss it seriously. The question is whether the Khrushchev decree was correct, whether the rapid transition to diesel and electric was actually the right choice for Soviet railroads, whether the disruption and the losses of the transition were worth what was gained. The honest answer is that, in the long view, the transition was probably inevitable. Diesel and electric traction were genuinely more efficient. The economics favored them, and the Soviet Union's chronic problems with labor supply and maintenance infrastructure made the lower labor demands of diesel particularly valuable. The P36 could not have run forever, and no steam locomotive, however excellent, was going to change the fundamental direction of railroad technology. But inevitable is not the same as correct in every detail of implementation. The decree's speed, its absolute character, its elimination of any possibility of gradual transition, created disruptions and losses that a more measured approach would have avoided. 251 P36 locomotives is not a number that reflects the machine's quality or its potential contribution to Soviet rail. It reflects the particular timing of a political decision, and political timing is not the same as engineering judgment. The P36 deserved a longer run, not forever, not in defiance of technology's direction, just longer, long enough for the locomotives already built to complete their useful lives, long enough for the routes they operated to benefit from the quality that had been invested in them, long enough for the men who drove them to accumulate the experience that turns a good locomotive into a deeply understood one, which is something different again. That longer run was denied. The decree saw to that. And so, the P36 remains in the historical memory the way that interrupted things remain, not as a complete story, but as a glimpse of what completeness might have looked like. Not as a chapter that reached its natural conclusion, but as a chapter cut short mid-sentence, the thought abandoned, the machine stilled, the question of what it might have become left permanently open. The last operational P36 in Russia runs occasionally on special excursion trains, pulling vintage passenger carriages through landscapes that the locomotive's designers would recognize, even as almost everything else about the world those designers inhabited has changed beyond recognition. When it moves, when the exhaust lifts from the chimney and the driving wheels turn and the red stripe catches the low angle of the Russian light, it looks like what it is. The best passenger steam locomotive the Soviet Union ever built, carrying 60 years of interrupted history through countryside that received it 60 years too late. The people who watch it pass do not know, most of them, what they are seeing. They see a beautiful old machine on an excursion train, a piece of heritage on a Sunday afternoon. They do not see the decree. They do not see the production line halted, the plans cancelled, the 250 locomotives that should have been 2,000 spread across the network. They do not see the institutional decision that ended the story before the story was finished. But the locomotive knows. Or if locomotives cannot know, then the engineers who preserve it know, and the historians who have spent years reconstructing what it was and what it should have been know. They know that this particular machine was good enough, reliable enough, beautiful enough to have earned a different ending. That it was denied that ending not because of anything it did, but because of when it lived, and who was signing documents that summer. Stalin had ordered the thousands. Khrushchev cancelled them all in an afternoon. And the P36, which had done everything asked of it, and had done it well, waited in the sidings for a future that the decree had already taken away. Some machines are worn out by the work. Some are broken by their own flaws. Some outlast their era through sheer durability and find new purpose in a world that has moved past what they were built for. And some are simply stopped, mid-sentence, mid-run, mid-purpose, halted by a signature before the story they were built to tell has been properly told. The P36 was that kind of machine, and the silence where its full history should have been is, in its own way, louder than anything its chimney ever produced. Share content PDF.